if you critically read news stories from the New York Times or the Washington Post or any major news source, you can definitely see a particular angle they take towards certain subject matter because they are owned by other business entities and they're not going to talk bad about those business entities because why would they why would they kill their parent company? It doesn't make any sense for them financially.
Yeah, I mean, right now the biggest kind of like elephant in the room is this Israel Hamas war.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, a lot of people feel like there's not enough coverage of the Palestinian side of things.
Yeah.
It doesn't feel like any major news outlet, including cable news, CNN, and all them, like are you know what I mean? It seems like they're really quick to have one-on-ones and interviews and Zoom calls with the IDF people and all that, but they're like no one's talking about it. And then the only time I'm hearing about like just the Palestinian people has to either be like Al Jazeera or like just social media posts from different people posting basically like citizen journalists, you know what I mean? Um and it's like to your point, it's because these bigger news outlets have a certain, they have to make sure certain people are happy and they can't afford to lose any sort of market share in that regard. And it sucks because it's to your point, like it feels slanted when you read it, and that's kind of like the most obvious and like most obvious example right now, you know. Um,
Yeah. No, I totally agree. I think it's amazing how little coverage the Palestinian side is getting and how so many news sources like they'll be like, "Oh yeah, totally the Palestinian people are suffering, but Hamas, Hamas, Hamas." And in the meantime it's like, "Yeah, but what like the
yeah.
Palestinian people are suffering because of what the Israeli government is doing, not what a terrorist group is doing." Like that's a
Hmm.
very different thing and a bigger issue, I would think, but they just kind of brush that off as a non-issue.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly how it is, man. What I kind of see for coming into the summer in terms of news coverage is that I feel like they're gonna just start peeling back, like pulling back on covering the war and kind of more focused on the election. And I think that'll be kind of like they're out for like not having to still cover Palestinians and all that because they're gonna be like, well, Trump's back on the campaign trail and hasn't been convicted, and we had to see what Joe Biden's gonna do for his side. Because I mean, even though he's like the favorite for the Democrats, but it's kind of like they're gonna try to figure out ways to cover it, even though it's not like the most important news happening in the world right now. When you have a war happening in the Middle East and you have another war happening in Russia, Ukraine, and yeah, it's gonna be like I feel like that's what's gonna happen, and they're gonna just kind of weasel their way out of it.
hmm Yeah, dude, because definitely, like, I even had to remember, I'm like, wait, is like Russia, Ukraine still going on? It's like all
Yeah.
of a sudden there's this huge pivot, and it's just whatever need, I guess they figured out the science of like, okay, how long can you milk something and stretch it out before you got to switch to a new topic to really have all of the media focus primarily on that instead, instead of really kind of following up, looking at where this stuff is going. Like only if there's like a new huge development, wait, maybe we get it back to it. But until then, how can they hold our attention?
Hmm.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's one of the other things that I want to focus on is not just the hot button topic issues. Like, I think those should be discussed, but I think it's almost more imperative to look back at the things that were once considered a really big deal that now everybody's forgotten about. I
Hmm.
think, like, just looking at what were the major news stories 6 months ago and looking at Ukraine. I mean, like the war in Ukraine is almost nowhere in the media right now, and there's still big things happening over there. I mean, Mike and I worked with a guy that is Russian and had to smuggle his friends out of Russia um, so that they could avoid being enlisted in the war. Like, it's still very much a very big thing. The Russian people are very much against the Russian government for the most part. And Ukraine did an amazing job fighting back against the Russians, but they are very strongly overpowered. And also looking at like what that would mean if Russia was able to take over that much of Ukraine, because Ukraine has a massive portion of the globe's oil reserves. Like it's all either
Hmm.
there or it's in the Middle East and around Saudi Arabia, the UAE. And I mean, you can see in Abu Dhabi like a perfect example of how much wealth is actually there.
Hmm.
And it gets very quickly like just set up for the top 0.001%. And with Russia, that's going toward the Russian government. And to think that that much wealth is going to be handed to a government that is very strongly against American interests and is currently leaning towards siding with China, which is also very strongly against American interests. Um, I mean, just recently, like they took back our pandas. I mean,
Yeah.
they're very clearly doing everything they can to push buttons to kind of shut down any kind of diplomacy with the U.S. and incite actions as much as possible. I mean, it's not a good situation, and for some reason, the mass media is talking about things that have nothing to do with this potentially major world threat.
Yeah. That's true, dude. I think the thing today, all I heard was, or even yesterday too, all I heard around the news was DeSantis called, that, went out, and I was like, okay, cool, but like, oh, I guess, yeah. Um, I don't know how much weight this has towards why I need to hear about it 24/7 for the day, but okay.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the thing. Is like the most annoying thing with these news cycles is like I know that's like the secret to things is like just repeat constantly and then it just seeps into your subconscious. But at the same time, you're like it almost seems so strategic too sometimes to get you to tune out of always dialing in like what's going on in the news, what's going on today. Because sometimes you'll just be like, oh, that's the conversation for today or the week. Okay, cool. And you just like tune out, you know?
Yeah, exactly. Again, to Jeremy's point, I haven't heard anything about Ukraine, Russia lately. I'm not as informed as I felt I was 6 months ago, or even more than that. And then about a year ago, I should say, that was like that started last year, in the beginning of last year. But like, Israel war, I feel like I'm hearing a little bit more of, not as much as it was in the beginning, like within that first 100-day mark. Now all I'm hearing is just DeSantis out, Nikki Haley looks like the favorite, and who's gonna who's gonna bump Trump and all that. And I'm just like, I don't know how much of this really matters, especially when we're just barely in, like, at when we're still in the end of January. You know what I mean?
Well, I would actually say that this bit matters, just because with Nikki Haley and DeSantis and Trump, DeSantis was very much a well, he wasn't a Trump light. He adopted a lot of the same demographic that Trump went after,
Hmm.
and he was more of a typical politician than Trump was, than Trump is. Um, so if he could have beaten out Trump and it was between DeSantis and Nikki Haley, I feel like the entire country would have been in a much better place. But since DeSantis lost and endorsed Trump instead of Nikki Haley,
Mm.
I think that's putting the entire country in a much, much worse place. Because if Nikki Haley wins the Republican nomination, I think she's going to win. There's no way Biden is going to beat Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
But if it's Biden and Trump, like I think almost universally, except for Trump extremists and like hardcore Democrats, nobody else is going to think that those are two good choices. It's bad choice and a miserably terrible choice. And
Yeah.
like, depending on what state you live in, because the way the electoral college works, your vote may not matter at all. Like,
Yeah.
there's certain states where you know it's going to go a certain way. There's no way to push it one way or the other. Like you can flux like maybe 5 percentage points, maybe 10 if there's like a really strong candidate that year. But I mean, if you're in California, you might as well not vote for president. If you're in New York City, you might as well not vote for president.
Hmm.
Like there's too many Democrats. Your vote is irrelevant. But in Texas, for instance, it's narrow enough where Texas could be flipped. I don't think
Hmm.
it's super likely, it was leaning that way, but then Beto kind of screwed everything up, and now it's like he was so close to a moderate. He almost took Texas and made it purple, and then he went extreme liberal right toward the end, and it kind of like ruined his chances of flipping Texas for the Senate, which in turn made people feel like Texas was more red than it actually was. So now I feel like that's going to lessen the chances of flipping Texas for the presidential election, particularly if Biden is the nominee, which it's looking like is very likely going to be the case. So I feel like if Biden wasn't the nominee and Beto had to flip Texas, Texas would be going Democrat this year, but that's not the case in two different levels. So I think it's just going to be once again Texas goes Republican because Texas goes Republican, not because of anything about the candidate themselves.
Man, that's such a shame because I know so many people, because so many people, left California to go to Texas. And I remember hearing so much concern about, oh man, these liberals, like there was even jokes
Mm-hmm.
about like commentary about, man, should they make it to where you have to be a resident for like 2 or more years, like maybe towards 5. I think if before they can have even be able to vote because there's so much concern about the state flipping. And to think that all that kind of backfired. I mean, I know there's still people moving to Texas because of everything going on in California. A lot of people are upset and don't like the policies. But man, to think that we almost had it and then he messed up. Yeah, man, you should have rode that moderate the whole way, especially in Texas. I mean, because a lot of even Democrats, liberals are getting kind of fed up with how extreme left-leaning things are getting. Um, and yeah, I think everyone wants to see a return to moderate. Um,
Yeah.
deep down,
Well,
yeah.
and it's funny too because it's not even necessarily like people want to go for moderates. It's that they want to go for people that actually care about solutions and
Mm,
they don't care as much about things that just really don't matter.
yeah.
When as soon as Beto started going after gun control and like magazine capacity limits and all of like the things that nobody like there are people that very strongly care about gun control on both sides of the aisle. They
Mm,
want more, they want less, but that's not what matters when it comes to the way the government functions. Like that's one of those hot button issues that you could just not discuss for a little bit, and because it's very likely not going to change. So if it's not going to change, let's just focus on the things that you can change that are going to make the country better, like infrastructure and all of the other things that really really matter in this country. And if he had focused on reforming our immigration system as opposed to the band-aid fixes that have been happening, I feel
mm,
like Texas in particular could have definitely gotten behind it. If he focused on having like finding a way to supersede I gosh, I can't remember his name right now. I lived in San Antonio for a while. I should remember it. But everybody just nicknamed him Wheels. The governor of Texas, Rick Abbott. No, not Rick Abbott.
Greg Abbott.
Greg Abbott. There we go. Thank you. But yeah, like he fought so hard to get the Texas power grid disconnected from all the other states so that it didn't have to follow federal guidelines. So the power grid in Texas is significantly weaker than every other state in the country because it doesn't even hit the minimum federal guidelines, which are supposed to be like every state needs to follow these because regardless of how warm or cold it is, you still have to do these certain things. And Greg Abbott was like, you know what? We're going to disconnect from the rest of the states so that we can make energy costs lower because we don't need all those restrictions. Of course, those restrictions they found out were extremely necessary when they had just slightly higher than normal summers. All of a sudden, the power grid shut down. When they had colder than normal winters, the power grid shut down. Like people were literally dying because of Greg Abbott's attempt to save money. And it didn't save that much money in the end anyway, because what company is going to reduce their costs, like reduce their prices to consumers? They Companies don't do that anymore. They don't get savings and pass that on to consumers. They get savings and then pocket that as record profits. Like, why would they not do that? That's the way that all companies do that nowadays. So people were dying for a pretend savings, and Greg Abbott had nothing to say about it aside from we're going to get us back on track, and didn't accept responsibility for it, didn't say, hey, we need to like increase our regulations so that they're back to what they should be. Like he had no plan for keeping the everyday citizen from Texas from dying because of a situation that he personally intentionally created, and somehow he was reelected. Like, that's insane to me. But I mean, that's the world we live in. People care more about voting their party than they do about voting for their own self-interest, when it's a very obvious direct, you could die if you vote for this person, and they'll still vote for him if they're the right party. And the same is true in California the other way around too. Like, you look at Newsom, like you you look at the way that California is being run right now, and it's being run into the ground, and nobody has any interest in stopping it. Like, the 10 cities in LA, Mike, as you very obviously know, we started off this discussion talking about the campfires that are being set up next to the building that almost burned down just a few days ago because of homeless people just invading that space. Like, these are really big issues that nobody has any interest in stopping. And particularly homelessness in LA is just insane to me, considering that you have so many empty office buildings, you have so many empty hotels, like you have so much space for people to go to, but it costs so much money that nobody can afford it. And then you're looking at like the cost of rent. I mean, when I lived out in LA, I was paying, I don't know, probably like $1,200 for a one bedroom that had a nice view in Studio City. Like, it wasn't in the nice part of town, but it wasn't in the bad part of town. And I had a view, which was nice. Um, had like covered parking and all that. And now that's going for over 3,000, over 3,000. Like, the cost of rent has almost tripled in the past 12 years. Like, just looking at the past 5 years, the cost of rent's gone up something like 70%. Like, it's insane how much the cost of rent and the cost of housing and interest rates, all of it is just exploding. So it's no wonder that people have no money to be able to have a place to live, because how are you going to be able to afford it, especially in an area like that? So people go to the place where they're like, hey, even if I don't have a roof over my head, I'm not going to die of cold or heat, and I'll be fine. And there's enough other homeless people there that they can kind of teach me how to get back on my feet, or can at least protect me as part of the homeless community. Not that that happens completely, and that might be a little naive to even think that, but I think that's definitely something that's in people's heads when they're choosing LA as the place to be homeless. Um, but I mean, then again, on top of it, like, maybe it's just a matter of they can't get out of LA once they finally do lose their home, whether that's a home that they're renting or a home that they own.